I would assume that most people here know all about Kootenay Meadows Dairy. The more I learned, as a bit of an outsider to the Kootenays, the more I realized I was coming to interview Kootenay farming royalty. But just for those who don't know, Erin, with a whole bunch of family and other helpers over in Creston, has Kootenay Meadows Dairy, which is, I guess I'm calling kind of a farm-to-table, vertically integrated, very community-oriented dairy, producing the milk, producing a lot of the grain and other crops that go into the milk, and then processing it into cheese and ice cream and milk and other milk products. And you're kind of doing it all, hey, Erin? Yeah. Okay, here's my first question for you. How eager are you, Erin Harris, to talk about your recent stint on CTV's reality TV show, Farming for Love?
Jared is at home. He's taking care of my half of our pack of a lot of dogs. It's such a funny thing because I think some people that get to know me via the farm and our social media and stuff probably thinks that I'm a relatively extroverted person, and like that show is very extroverted, but anybody who knows me personally knows I like leave the farm like twice a year. So it was very outside of my comfort zone, but it worked out. Jared is lovely, and apparently that's how I needed to meet someone, was have some other people collect a bunch of men and bring them to my farm.
Well, the reason I bring it up is because I only really have one question about it, which is like, what was it like? I'm sure you've watched reality television before, and I just like have to assume that it's quite surreal to see the difference between the final narrative and the final product and like living the day-to-day and seeing behind the scenes. Like that must have been really weird to see that.
Yeah, it was super bizarre because they filmed 6 days a week and usually 8 to 10 hours. Mm-hmm. And then that week would be condensed into an episode. And a lot of the times, mostly because there was very little drama on our farm, there was only like 10 minutes out of, like 60 hours of footage. So it was always shocking to see what they picked.
Okay, well, I'm glad you put it that way, Erin, because I was thinking about that and just thinking about how there's kind of a parallel between that, what must have been a weird experience to see the day-to-day and then the final product, and like narratives about farming, right? Yeah. In a lot of ways, farming is made for telling stories, right? Mm-hmm. Like the aesthetics of farming are just so appealing to most people who in society who aren't farmers. And so what we end up seeing presented about farming is not the whole picture, right? Yeah. And it's usually just this really appealing summary of farming. And we were talking a little bit before we sat down together, and I asked you we were talking about different things we might think about today and talk about today, and you talked about just that you wanted to maybe touch on how you almost feel like too rosy a picture gets painted about not just farming in general, but your farm and what you do. Yeah. And you mentioned being an organic farmer and a regenerative farmer. So what did you mean by that when you said it's too rosy a picture?
Yeah, I think it's always an interesting balance. I find like with our social media, I really try and show sort of as much of both sides of the farm as you can, but you are also still trying to sell a product. And I absolutely love our farm, and I don't want people to think that I'm ungrateful for being able to farm the way I believe and be able to do what we do. But the reality of any farm, and especially dairy, is it doesn't ever end. Like it is a constant job. We milk with robots, which is amazing, but it means that they can call my phone anytime. If I don't answer, it keeps calling every 120 seconds until I do answer. And because there's just the two of them, if they're down at 1 a.m., I need to go out and fix that. Mm-hmm. It also agriculture is just can be incredibly isolating. You often work alone. You often, put lots of time in alone, working on sort of menial tasks. And two, just the capital expenditure of farming. And like, especially for myself, like, it is a family business, but I purchased my family business in 2023 fully financed through FCC. So I have a massive debt load at super high interest rates. So, you know, I love what I do and I'm happy, but like at the end of the day, every day there's that like, I have a short-term mortgage commitment that I need to make sure this is making. So, yeah.
You said, you even said, I mean, I'm going to call this paraphrasing, but it's just about a quote. When we talked about this previously, things that are often painted as too rosy, it's actually really hard and it can be awful.
Yeah. Yeah, I think
What are some examples of when it feels awful?
Yeah, I'd say for me, some of that is well, on the farm side, it is the really late nights. Like just the other day, we had gone into town for trivia, and I said I've got a new hired girl. We'd gone in, and I said, oh, it's probably just a quick fix in the barn. I'll go fix it, and then I'll show you in the morning. I think it's just this set screw. And I was in the barn until 6 a.m. So I went out at 8, and I was in there till 6 because the one robot needed a new laser. So I had to rewire and everything of that, which it's not the end of the world, but it is a long, brutal night. Mm-hmm. And then on the processing side, the Kootenays is amazing in terms of its support of local food, in terms of its buy-in to local agriculture, but the shipping logistics within the Kootenays on a product that is heavy, that is breakable, that is perishable, it can just be exhausting. Like as soon as you fix one issue, you often have another one come up. Or even recently, we've been trying to make sure we get all of our end product sampling out to labs, but the only labs are in the Lower Mainland. The only shipping routes from Creston usually take 3 or 4 days. So in the summer, we're really struggling to get milk to labs to be tested for like our BC Center for Disease Control licensing at temperature. So we're having milk arrive at 7 or 8 degrees and testing outside of a parameter, and then struggling to get a new sample up there to be within your monthly, like your monthly testing and stuff. So just the practical realities of processing somewhere that is far from larger centers can be exhausting. Like it can often just feel like you're putting out one fire after the other.
Yeah, and just like in a really high regulatory environment, you're touching, you kind of just touched on this, but I was interviewing North Okanagan organic dairy farmer Quentin Bruns this year, and he mentioned to me that they didn't hit a temperature point that they needed to for bringing their milk down to cool, and he had to dump something like 4,000 gallons of milk, and no choice, right?
Yeah.
That's, I mean, that alone has got to be really hard to experience when, you know, it comes up, or because it can, I guess.
It definitely can, and yeah, like I say, there's just a lot of regulatory framework that you're trying to work within that is then further complicated by our regional realities.
What was your perspective, like when we talk about hardship, risk, stress, what was your perspective on it growing up? I mean, I have to imagine it wasn't so bad. I mean, it wasn't so bad that you didn't come and purchase the darn farm, but like, did you see it in your parents' time?
Yeah, and I mean, I did see it even before I purchased the farm. But yeah, definitely, like I know my parents, when we were kids, like they worked really, really hard. They bought the dairy when I was 3. So they were also relatively new entrants into a quota system that's quite expensive to get into. So my parents both worked full-time on the dairy as kids. As kids, it was great because our parents were always home. But it also meant like we took 2 vacations when I was growing up because that was the 2 times we could get away.
Both to the Wisconsin Dairy Festival?
There was always a lot of farm tours involved in every time we got away. But yeah, so definitely saw it a bit as a kid. And then I did see it for myself when I had come home from university initially, and then when I came back to the farm again. I do think the trade-off, at least still for me, is worth it for the days that can be absolutely awful. But I just think it's a really important like conversation to have, because I think especially local food and regenerative agriculture and organics, like I say, gets this really rosy image. And I think it's important to talk about that it can be really awful too, and like it can take a pretty big toll on your mental health.
Well, I would say I'm an organic farmer too.
Yeah.
I much smaller scale than you. I grow ground crops, and I'm oversimplifying a little bit. But when we talk about organic practices, regenerative practices, one part of that paradigm or framework is kind of trying to get away from this obsession with control of the farm ecosystem, right? And trying to introduce things like diversity. And that's the kind of thing that on the website looks amazing, but it also, in various ways in your different parts of your pharmacology, just introduces more unpredictability, more risk, and that leads to more chaos and disasters. That tends to get glossed over when we're interacting with the public.
Yeah, I would say like that, especially like you say, and like just more failure, right? Like if you're, a lot of conventional practices are relatively tried and true. Like I know we've even in the last, like since I bought the farm, I went to raising my calves on nurse cows, and we went through a real period where I really struggled with calf health. And so then you're trying to balance this. Am I making the right decision for the calves, for the cows, for the farm, for my customers? And on paper, it all works. But then in practice, if I've got sick calves, there's that stress. So yeah, it's definitely that, like, it's easy to see the glossy, happy, like calves on cows on grass, which I love and love that we have. But then there's all the back work of making those sort of different systems work in practice.
I'm going to turn briefly to all of you and say that a few years ago now, a colleague of mine reached out to a bunch of his colleagues. He's a livestock producer, and got us all to create dark versions of our farm's Instagram accounts. So a completely separate account that we set to private. It's, you have to approve everyone's participation. And it was where we did the mirror opposite of our fancy farm Instagram with like all the rosy stuff. And all we posted was the failure and the chaos and the misery. What was amazing about it is that we all took comfort. Super cathartic, yeah, and a lot of laughs and whatever, and a lot of dark stuff. I really have to say, we've been through as an industry a pretty tough few years. If we think about the heat dome and drought and fires, and we're going to segue into something else in a moment. But I did want to ask you, like, what represented at least a relative real challenge or rock bottom for you? When was your mental health hit the hardest, and what would have been the precipitating event in these last few years?
I'd say, to be honest, some of the hardest on my mental health has been this last growing season. Our essentially bread and butter for the dairy herd is our second cut hay, and I got about 50% of what we traditionally would get, because it rained in May, and then it rained last week. So we just did not have the moisture. It was extremely hot. And so worrying about, we've been a couple years of drought, so we're needing to purchase some grain, which it makes up a very small portion of the diet, but the second cut is essentially their main feed all through the winter, until I can be back on fresh pasture. So definitely really struggled throughout this summer, being worried about, meeting production targets, as well as, what are we going to do? Can we purchase in some feed? Am I going to just produce a little less and balance in more first cut? We got a decent chunk of third cut, so that sort of has helped that a little bit. But it definitely was, it was a very stressful season that way. And actually, just something that I think is important to talk about too, with farming and mental health and things too, is that there is a program called AgSafe in BC. So you can get 8 free therapy sessions as a farmer, which I accessed after my second cut came in at 50% of its usual yield. So I think that's a really valuable program, and that I think in agriculture we generally don't talk that much about mental health, and it often kind of gets pushed under the rug. So I just think, yeah, if anyone is having a hard time, that AgSafe program is really good. And I found it super easy to access. Like I just
was
sort
gonna-
of
yeah, you
contacted the one therapist and was like, I need help. And she was like, okay, we can set up a session next week. And I was like, oh, okay. I thought there'd be more hoops to jump through. But yeah, it was quite easy to get on with.
Now, Erin, unlike me, I would look at you and think this is the last person, given what I have learned about your business, who's ever going to feel like a failure or an imposter. And am I right about that, or does that happen to you
no,
too?
I feel like that every single day. Yeah. And there's a little clip from the movie Mulan when the ancestors pop up and the one guy goes, "Not to mention they'll lose the farm." And that little clip plays in my head about 50 times a day whenever I make a decision that, oh God, am I going to make the ancestors mad with this decision? But I think that it's easy to, maybe not easy, but I think it is part of my personality that I sort of project this extrovert confidence that I don't actually have.
Okay, I'm going to shift gears a little bit here. Tell me, I want to talk about supply. We live in a supply management system as far as dairy and poultry in British Columbia. But your farm is very much a dairy that, as I said at the outset, it's vertically integrated. It's supplying like all this impressive list of retail outlets all through your region. Mm-hmm. You have the on-farm store. It's not in that sense like a standard or conventional dairy in the province that is sending its milk out to other processors to deal with, right? And I'm just wondering, does that create any challenges? Does having to work within supply management, is that challenging for you? Are the ways in which you've broken the mold to an extent made more, or have they been made more challenging by the system we're in?
Yeah, I think like working within any bureaucratic system is definitely a challenge for any producers. We really find that we're such a minority in the dairy industry in terms of farms that produce and process their own milk. There's 6 of us in the province, and we represent, it's like 0.3% of the milk in the province is processed by a farm on the farm.
On the farm, yeah.
And so, in my opinion at least, the system really hasn't caught up to that sort of shift in what our food system is looking for. Mm-hmm. So, we really see it in the Kootenays, that very strong demand for a product that is produced locally, that's processed locally, and for us too, like from a single farm, being able to know the exact origin of where your product came from. And I don't know that our system doesn't really recognize that yet.
And this, if I could interrupt,
Yeah.
I read you sent me a letter that you and a colleague or two had sent to Lana Popham, the former ag minister, a couple of years ago. It comes down to the way to an extent within supply management, it's dictated to you the prices you're charging. Mm-hmm. Could you attempt to explain to a general audience here why that doesn't work so well for you because you're processing on farm?
Yeah, so it's definitely a very convoluted system, and I could talk about the supply management system for ages, but I will attempt to do it in 9 minutes here. But so basically, the way it works is each individual farm has their quota that is their right to produce a certain volume of milk. That all of that milk, regardless of where it is being processed, has to be sold to the BC Milk Marketing Board. And then that milk from the board is distributed to processors based on their demand. So each processor buys that milk at a designated price, which is designated by what its end use will be. So class 1 milk is fluid milk and fluid cream. And then there's a couple classes that are different cheeses. There's a class for ice cream. Basically, there's 6 classes, and then there's letters within the classes. And depending on what you're producing, they sell it to you at those end prices.
Right, so just to try to keep it really simple, if the milk is going to go to a processor making cheese, they're going to pay a lot less per unit, right, compared to if it's going to go to be straight into bottles for milk, right?
Yeah, so the price you pay for class 1, which is that fluid, that's the highest price.
Yeah.
And then it goes down like based on where it's going, as well as there is about 30% of the BC market now that's sold on the international market. So it's sold at about 16 cents a liter, which I don't know any producer that can produce milk for 16 cents a liter. So, but then all of the milk that's shipped to processors, all of the income is pooled together into what's called a blend price. So that's what each producer gets paid. So we get paid a blend price at the raw tank in the barn. And then for us, as a processor, we pay those end-use class prices at our plant. And so anybody that's been to the farm, you know that the plant and the barn are about 100 feet apart, and there's a gravity-fed pipeline between the two. But we pay, right now, it's about 38% more for the milk that enters our plant than we get paid for it at our tank. So for me last year, that represented almost $250,000 of revenue that basically evaporates from my barn down to the plant.
Because it goes into a pool in terms of...
On paper.
On
so
paper.
Our milk never leaves the farm.
Yeah.
Yeah, on paper, it goes into the provincial pool and then is sent out to Kootenay Meadows.
Okay. All right. So that is it's hard to wrap the head around.
Yeah.
But what maybe let's jump into you have some ideas about how that could be different, and maybe in telling us how it could be different, it'd be a little bit easier to grasp exactly what the issue is, right?
Maybe, yeah. So I think part of the challenge is there is a license within our province for processors that process on farm but don't do fluid. So it's called a cottage industry. So basically they still hold quota. They have to produce within their quota, but they don't sell or buy their milk from the board. Basically they produce their quota, they process it on farm, they ship it out. There's no money changes hands within going in and out of the pool.
Yeah.
But they don't consider fluid milk an artisanal product. So when I have spoken to the board about it, what I've been told is milk, customers don't care, which I would say they have not talked to very many customers or consumers lately, because at least in the Kootenays and throughout the province with other processors, consumers don't see every milk as exactly the same.
But the thing is, the reason, even if it's true, the reason they don't care is because we have a system where milk is pooled.
Yeah.
You literally can't enjoy the terroir of milk because it's all going. Whereas that's where you stick out in the system, because actually your customers are tasting the milk from your Jersey cows, right?
Yeah.
Compared to the Holsteins that are standard or whatever.
Yeah, and so the system right now is there's only one license if you're doing fluid. So it doesn't matter the size of your farm, you're all licensed the same. So like we are licensed the same as like Saputo, who's processing millions of liters. So what we've proposed multiple times and always been told no, but I still think it's a good solution, would be a different licensing structure within the province. So if you are going to process your own milk on your own farm, even if you're going to do fluid, I think that we should all fall in that cottage industry program. Or if they don't want to do that, an additional license for fluid on-farm processing. And that if you wanted to bring in milk from the pool, like say we grow so much, I want to bring in a bunch of milk, then I would have to carry a different license to do that as well.
Right.
Is one of the things that I think could work. And that would be provincially, like licensing, that part is controlled provincially. Our system is also convoluted because it's provincial and then regional, so there's a Western milk pool, and then there's the national milk pool. So it gets increasingly more complicated, but on a national scale, they could also include an additional class of milk, so you could have a class of milk that is just milk that's processed on the farm. They could just price it at the same as the blend.
What's interesting to me beyond your own specific case is that I interview dairy farmers, and I think there's an assumption that because we're in a supply management system, everyone's doing great, and that's not what they tell me. With the inflation that's happened, even though there's been approvals to the prices they're getting for milk, they're not keeping up with all of the pressures that are coming to bear on farmers. And so what's interesting in a broader sense is that you and your family have and are demonstrating an opportunity to carve out a really interesting niche, right, where you can start to celebrate what your dairy products taste like, and you can gain a real regional following. And meanwhile, we hear at the provincial level, like, we need more support for different forms of processing because we've lost it over the last 30 or 40 years in this province, right? I'm just thinking, like, this is actually start to be repeated, but as you're highlighting, this is not a system that has been built to accommodate it, and that we need some reforms in order to, because I'm going to be honest, I can't be the only one. I don't totally grasp what you were saying exactly about why this is brutal for you with this pricing, but I get it. You're doing something different. The system is not designed to accommodate that.
Yeah, I think that's sort of the takeaway, and like say that price differential, and we've brought that up to the province as well, and that I also think regional food systems are really important in terms of like resiliency, like the last panel was talking about. Like I know, so there was the massive flooding in the Lower Mainland a couple of years ago, and so we couldn't do that much, but we stopped making cheese for a couple weeks so that we could push more milk into the West Kootenays, because the West Kootenays is supplied from the Lower Mainland. So that milk wasn't getting into grocery stores. And if there's a fire that cuts off the valley, we could actually help process the milk within our valley. So like, I really think that our system isn't yet built for supporting regional food networks and a more diverse range of processors. I forget what the exact terminology was, but it meant big processors. When they told me what they were actually looking for, I think it was reasonably scaled was the PC term that I was told, that what they were actually looking for in processing versus small regional processors.
Okay, we have just enough time for one more question.
Yeah.
Tell me about one of your farming mentors.
Yeah, so I would say my main farming mentor would be my dad. I feel like I'm very lucky that I grew up in a family that empowered their daughters and their sons to either love or hate agriculture as much as they wanted to. There was never anything I wasn't able to learn how to do on the farm. And he was very much just look outside the box and let's try and make the neighbors confused about what we're doing. So that I really felt like was a really good thing to learn young. And to be empowered as a female farmer. I think I'm one of 3 solo female dairy owners in the province.
So what's something about your dad that you try and emulate?
I would say definitely that sort of thinking outside the box and being willing to try multiple new things. And with it sort of ties into that regenerative ag, being brave enough to do some really weird stuff that sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. I roller crimped some gorgeous triticale this year, and it was a mistake in hindsight. But at the time, it seemed like a good idea, and it will build soil really nicely. So yeah, being brave enough to do some of those things is something I like to emulate from Wayne.
Erin, I really just want to thank you for what you do and for taking on the risk that you have, right? In reading your story, I see what your parents built, and now I see the big risk that you've taken on to keep it going. And I wish you all the best. It looks like a fantastic farm and a really great family. Thanks so much for talking to me.
Thank you.